sea water level, air pollution, and of course, habitat condition. But what is emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases? In this slide, I'm showing you examples. So you have either a new location for the chikungunya, the Ebola, the dengue, new location because they've been here for several years already, these viruses, but supposedly only in the tropical countries. But now you're seeing them also in the northern hemisphere. Okay, you also have new diseases by a new pathogen, or you have a newly identified diseases of a previously unknown pathogen, sample of which was HIV. Down the line, you also have newly identified reservoirs of old infection, for example, the coronavirus or SARS in civet cats or the MERS-CoV in camels. And then you also have old infections that have reemerged and become resistant, or old infections reemerging as a result of breakdown in public health initiatives. And in the reemerging, you actually have a new time. So, for example, for the measles, you have where it has been eradicated in some countries, it's now being seen again because of uh, vaccine hesitancy. No one wants to get vaccinated anymore against measles. And then you also have the travel factor. If you heard about it, one of the major examples will be the outbreak of measles in Disneyland in the western coast of the U.S. Okay. Now let's start with the viruses. You have the chikungunya virus. The agent is an alpha virus. The host usually is humans. You have the Aedes mosquitoes, and you have in some areas you have wild primates bitten by forest dwelling Aedes mosquitoes. The breeding ground for these mosquitoes, unclean water supply. Usually these are the stagnant waters. That's why in clinical practice, we always ask patients about uh, what does your environment look like? Do you have collecting vessels around your area? Do you live near a creek, which is slow flowing and stuff like that? There also have factors again in relation to urbanization, travel, and climate change. So, what is the clinical syndrome? The symptom is 3 to 7 days after the bite of the infected mosquito. The syndrome is fever and joint pains. Some patients will have non-specific symptoms but constitutional, like headache, myalgia, joint swelling, or rash. Those at risk for disease are in the ends of the spectrum of age, the older adults and the newborns, and people with medical conditions in between, like hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease. Fun fact, a trivia, I actually had chikungunya virus several years ago. The joint pain is actually very debilitating. It can last for several months, even if the fever has resolved in a span of the week. So most people will feel better within a week. However, joint pain can be severe and disabling. And it doesn't choose if it's a large joint or a small joint. Any joint can be affected. For my case, I had it on my uh, right elbow and my right knee. So it was like having an osteoarthritis at that time. Treatment is symptomatic. It's either rest, fluids, acetaminophen, or paracetamol. You're not recommended or advised to take aspirin or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs such as ibuprofen until dengue has been ruled out definitively to reduce the risk of bleeding. And you will notice for most of these conditions, there will be no antibiotics because we're talking about viruses. Let's now go to dengue virus. It's a flavivirus, and then your are the humans. Intermediate hosts will be mosquitoes, usually sometimes monkeys in Malaysia and Africa. Again, this is Aedes. So the chikungunya, dengue, and Zika virus. You have the Aedes as your intermediate host. Breeding ground for mosquitoes, again, the same because you have the same intermediate host. Uh, Please verify or state in the chat box that you were able to access the documents that were sent yesterday, the dengue guideline. Yes. Okay. So the dengue guideline and the monkeypox. Okay. We'll go to that later. But I sent this guideline in particular because under the universal health care, you should start knowing that you'll be under the universal healthcare when you practice. And there's a compendium, a set of guidelines that DOH has collaborated to produce with other societies so that there's a standard for care for uh, Filipino patients. Okay? So this is an important guideline for you to know. It is a must know. And because dengue uh, is so endemic in the Philippines, it's a must read. Okay. So you also have in the environment, socioeconomic and infrastructure related factors. A national epidemic, more than 270,000 cases alone in 2019. If you can imagine the WHO flagging the Philippines during a meeting that saying, "Hey, you guys have too much dengue cases." By October, 3 years ago, you almost have 191 cases, and that's only in a month's time, which was such an increase, with a case fatality rate of 0.3% and reported throughout the year here in our country. It's a major public health concern because it's the most rapidly spreading mosquito-borne viral disease in the Philippines and worldwide. And again, you can see the dengue occurrences popping up in different parts of the world, which are not tropical countries. Clinical syndrome, sometimes you're asymptomatic. How do you know? Cannot say. The presentation is like a flu illness. It's a mild febrile illness in most. Some will have a critical or multi-organ failure, presenting as blood plasma leakage, which is called dengue hemorrhagic fever. And in the physical examination, this is what you look for. So the WHO 2009 case classification is dengue with warning signs or severe dengue. And you have to look for the warning signs. So you have here the clinical classification. That means your patient has to fit the particular description based on the probability. And then you have a laboratory confirmation, that's dengue confirmed. And then you have the warning signs of vomiting, abdominal pain, tenderness, lethargy, mucosal bleeding, impaired consciousness, hepatomegaly as a physical exam finding, signs of acute renal failure. Your patient can have pruritus, decreasing sensorium, decreased hearing output, and other comorbidities. You have to look for or check that your patient is not pregnant, if they're obese, or if they have other comorbid conditions. Showing you here on the right part of the screen are the affected organ systems. Again, you have to look for them in the physical examination. And in this particular guideline, they're saying that um, they're suggesting laboratory tests to check, for example, increasing hematocrit with or without a decrease in platelet count, and elevation of transaminase or impaired coagulation markers. Starting you guys early in evidence-based medicine, the prognostic factors for severe dengue progression was reviewed in this guideline, and they said that these factors will show you the effect estimates or the risk of progressing to dengue. So the highest here would be your impaired consciousness, and down the line, you have increasing hematocrit with or without a drop in platelet, thrombocytopenia alone, acute renal failure. However, as to the certainty of evidence, they saw that vomiting and lethargy or restlessness, and if your patient is pregnant, especially in the third trimester, it will be, or with abdominal pain or tenderness, that will be uh, more likely than those with low certainty of evidence. But all those are risks. Okay. Now you test it with an antigen test, and this guideline broke it down into the overall diagnostic accuracy, accuracy by symptom onset, nature of infection, the dengue serotype, or even the brand or the manufacturer pack. Okay. However, a negative NS1 will not rule out an infection. Uh, WHO is actually suggesting that even at the primary care level, people with negative NS1 antigen should also be tested eventually for dengue IgM antibodies to determine possible recent dengue exposure. So you have a moderate sensitivity with high heterogeneity, meaning when they pulled all the studies, they saw that there were differences either in description of the condition with or the timing of the test and some other factors. But it has excellent specificity as to the accuracy by symptom onset. It's important to know that it's most sensitive if you do it within 3 days time since symptom onset, and a pool sensitivity gradually decreases beyond that particular period. If you're going to do the IgM, IgG, or the serologic test, a rapid diagnostic test, you use the combination of the NS1 with IgM with IgG. Okay? A pooled sensitivity of 86% and the high specificity if you use this combination. Again, the timing will be important. If you're going to use it with the NS1, you have to follow the recommendations regarding the timing of less than 3 days, which is why if you do this together and if you have a negative for this one or a negative test for IgM, IgG, you'll have to repeat the test again. If you're going to do the serologic markers alone, low sensitivity really and a moderate specificity, and you'll have to look for a positive IgM test. Okay? It's more accurate when you use it for secondary infections, but it has to be more than 5 days since symptom onset. And when they looked at the diagnostic tests, it's important also to know because when you start ordering those tests, it's important to know how much your test costs, and even more importantly, would be the accuracy of the test with which you will use. But the gold standard will still be a PCR test. And however, this is really quite expensive, and not all hospitals will be carrying this particular test. You'll have to send those tests for PCR to private hospitals, or for government hospitals, it will be at RITM or the Research Institute of Tropical Medicine in Alabang. How do we treat the patients? Hydration, it's based on weight and depends on the clinical severity of the patient. From a prevention standpoint, even if the vaccine is available in other parts of the world, it's not available in the Philippines. And as far as we're concerned, it's avoiding the bite of the mosquito using repellents and mosquito nets. Any questions so far? Any of you had dengue before? None? Nobody? Nobody has dengue before? Only one? Can you describe it? Even only on the, if you don't want to speak up, in the chat box. They describe it as breakbone fever.
For me po, Doc, I'll just keep my um camera off because my connection is shaky. But
No worries.
I presented po with high grade fever, and if I remember, like 3 to 4 days, and that's when I started to break out with the rashes that were very itchy. I also had an unusual presentation because I got optic neuritis from it.
Wow. Okay. Oh, which you saw in the image.
Yes, po.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a very rare complication.
yes, it lasted for like from Feb to April. I had like central blurring of vision. Po.
Oh, okay. But you're better. You're
Yes,
better
po,
now?
yes, po.
Okay. And no transfusion.
No transfusion, po.
Yes, okay. So you actually describe the phases of the condition. So you have a fever phase, which is which signifies viremia or the presence of the virus in the blood. And sometimes it cannot even it's insignificant to ask when they were bitten by mosquitoes because basically they will not remember. But the incubation period is 8 to 12 days since the bite. Okay, so that's particularly long, and people or patients will not really remember. So you have a febrile phase, a critical phase where you have the your body has been able to react to the presence of the virus, and then the release of all the inflammatory markers or reactions like cytokines and causing the plasma leakage eventually, which signifies the critical phase. That's why in dengue you have to first hydrate and then pull back. You have to know when to pull back. That's why you have also the laboratory test. Because when you give too much hydration, that's the time you can see all these complications. But in several studies, it's only the hematocrit that will uh, tell you that the patient will actually bleed. Okay, so I showed you already the odds ratio. It's top two for the hematocrit. Okay, thank you for sharing. It's a nice story. Not nice in the sense that you had a complication, but you know what I mean. It's nice to know that uh, the disease or the studies actually are true. Okay, next. Now let's go to Ebola virus disease. Is it in the Philippines? No. However, it's uh, endemic in other parts of the world, and there's a possibility that it will be a re-emerging condition because there will no, I mean it will be an emerging condition because you have history or if you search it, it occurred already in the U.S. because of history of travel and all that. Okay, so you have humans as the host and non-human primates, sometimes the fruit bats, porcupines, forest antelopes. You have the environment of blood or body secretions from the infected host as exposure, breastfeeding from an infected parent, sexual contact, hunting in forests, or contact with bushmeat mainly. This is in relation to practices in Africa. Okay, so the human to human transmission takes place through direct person to person contact exposure, and no evidence so far of aerosol or respiratory droplet transmission in natural outbreak settings. I'm summarizing everything here in this slide in relation to clinical syndrome. You have an incubation period of almost 3 weeks plus, and average, give or take 2 weeks or 12 days. The hallmark of the filovirus pathogenesis is this pronounced modulation and dysregulation of immune responses. In this slide, you will see that there is a clinical presentation on yellow and laboratory findings in relation to the occurrence of the disease broken down into the the peak phase, early phase, and the peak phase. Okay. So first you have non-specific symptoms again, fever, fatigue, anorexia, myalgia, headache, just like we saw with chikungunya, just like what we saw with dengue. That's why when you start seeing patients with this particular symptoms, you really have to get into the differential diagnosis and make sure that you rule out based on history of travel, based on history of exposure, based on history of vaccination, and everything like that. Okay? Don't just always think that, oh, fever, it's a simple SVI, or fever and body aches, it might just be fluid. Really, you have to, in in these current times, you really have to look into all these conditions. So what happens is that the virus gets into our body, um, and then it targets several cells, particularly macrophages. And when the infected macrophages react by secreting pro-inflammatory cytokines, which is the response, okay, that leads to further recruitment of macrophages to the site of infection that is affected. Okay, and then you also have in our immune system armamentarium the dendritic cells, which in this case will not activate or secrete cytokines. Okay, and there is an expression of MH2 class antigens, which will be suppressed, which is why eventually you will see here that the patient will have a drop in WBCs. This drop is really what will matter. Okay? The immunosuppression will occur in part by the massive depletion of the lymphoid cells in the lymph nodes, in the spleen, and in the thymus in the absence of an effective humoral and cell mediated immune system. As you see here, there's a really slow increase and actually an eventual drop. And this is a direct consequence of lymphocyte death and will explain the severe lymphopenia that the patients will actually manifest. Other pathogenic hallmarks will be coagulopathy, as you see here, and then your patient might have hepatic synthetic dysfunction and eventually disseminated intravascular coagulation. What's really striking about the occurrence of Ebola virus infection is that you have all these changes in coagulation. However, your patient is not going to bleed outward. You cannot see the overt bleeding. Everything is inside. So basically, the endothelial environment will be more of flooded with secretions and body fluids, and then your patient will have edema, respiratory distress. Uh, what else? So patients will manifest with septic shock. So the prevention of the infection consisted primarily, and it's basic. In outbreaks, it will be isolation of cases, contact tracing, effective infection prevention and control measures, and in relation to the environment, it will be safe burial practices for most if you're in Africa. Treatment consisted only of limited supportive clinical care, and then again, often confined or constrained by infield capacity or wherever it has occurred. The diagnosis, uh, acute phase blood or serum RT-PCR, and direct IgM capture or the serologic test only for detection of antibodies from patients in the later stages of the disease or those who have been able to mount antibody response if there you have survivors. And you have an electron microscopy evaluation because the Ebola virus has this particular shape that you can see. Again, it's important to know the differential diagnosis. In the slide I showed you earlier, you can have uh, dengue, you can have chikungunya, you can have Zika, you can have all the other viruses, but you'll also have bacterial infections to consider in relation to the presentation. So if you're talking about liver changes, it will be leptospirosis based on risk, salmonella, bloodstream infection, or bacteremia with septic shock, and some other conditions. Okay. And for the PCR, you have a detection limit of 1,000 to 5,000 viral load. And there's actually a vaccine that they put out recently. for prevention. This is a live attenuated recombinant vaccine called Ervebo. Okay, but that vaccine again is focused in Africa because it's the EVD outbreak is occurring there. Okay, question so far? You should be anticipating where we're going with exams, okay? It will always be about clinical syndromes, risk factors, how to prevent. Very easy. Okay, next. HIV. You had this lecture? That's why I place it here. You had this lecture already?
Yes po, Doc.
Do you have any questions regarding that particular lecture? I understand it was by Dr. Paneligan. Yes, no, yes, no questions. I'm sure he emphasized the number of cases in the Philippines, correct? Guys.
Yes po, Doc.
Okay. And then it's important because it's been with us since 1980s. And from a country standpoint, the Philippines is in the top four. Okay? We're having rising cases that we cannot seem to curtail. And there are so many factors in relation to that. But it should not be because the HIV program of the Philippines has picked up compared to previous years, siguro mga 10 years ago. It's better now. But you have so many issues still with stigma that have to be addressed. So that will be the particular environment there. But most of the questions will be coming on HIV will be coming from Dr. Panaligan. That's why I'm not showing it here. Okay? Are we clear with that? I'm assigned 25 questions. Let's go. Monkeypox virus. Anyone has had this? Has this? Saw this? Wala. Wala talaga. No idea. This is a very interesting disease. You have the Poxviridae family, humans and non-human primates, and sometimes small rodents as host. Close contact exposure, breakdown in infection control measures of isolation, uh, contact tracing, and also travel. I'm including this because it is in the Philippines. Okay? You have monkeypox occurring primarily around rainforest. It started in Central Africa. And human infection has occurred from handling infected animals, giant poached rats, monkeys. You have infection resulting from direct contact with blood, bodily fluids, or external lesions of infected hosts. And sometimes eating inadequately cooked meat of infected animals is a risk factor, as occurs in Africa. And for most human infections, the source is not known. Now, if you heard about this, it started to become news because of the occurrence of the lesions in a part of Europe after a large event, and then there were when they did epidemiologic background, they looked into most patients had sexual contact with a patient who had that particular lesion or started out to have that particular lesion. From a healthcare standpoint, it's human to human transmission with infected respiratory droplets, skin lesions, or contaminated objects. Healthcare workers and household members of active cases will be at higher risk of infection, and most outbreaks will occur in families or close contact areas. You have a severe rash, typically self-limiting but can lead to severe illness or death. The case fatality rate is 11% in most cases. It was first identified in non-human primates and back in 1970 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Sorry, they have almost 1,000 cases per year since 2005. Can you imagine 1,000 per year? But this is the summary of it all. This is from CDC. Looking into the different clades of the virus, based on the clade, you have a particular geography or what countries have been affected by it, the current situation where you can see it, and what is important for us to know is what is known about how it is spread or the mortality rate. And there is a vaccine. You actually have two vaccines, 2 doses, 4 weeks apart, given intradermally or subcutaneously. And the treatment is assessing the patient's need for hydration, pain relievers, because this is a really painful lesion. Okay, and supportive care mainly. Sometimes we have to refer to psych because the isolation will require a very prolonged period, especially if the patient is not used to being in isolation or if the patient is stable enough to be in their home and can meet the infection prevention and control requirements of isolation and ventilation. That will be better as in relation to the vaccine, it should be given as soon as possible, ideally within 4 days of exposure. Why am I mentioning this? Uh, Even if the vaccine is not available, eventually it will become available maybe by the time you guys practice. Okay. Administration 4 to 14 days after exposure may still provide some protection, and persons exposed to mpox through sexual contact who are asymptomatic should also be tested for HIV and other sexually transmitted infections. And perhaps you should discuss and facilitate access to HIV pre exposure prophylaxis for people who are HIV negative and at risk for HIV. Prevention wise, you have to avoid skin to skin contact. Sometimes, if the lesions are not weeping or not bad, you can just cover with gauze and um, send the patient home in an isolated environment at home. And avoiding contact will include prevent sharing of utensils and cups, and handling their bedding or clothing. If you do get mpox, isolate at home, cover your lesions, wear a mask if you must be around others. Okay. So was in 2018 to 2019, 19 where cases were actually confirmed among travelers from Nigeria, and they saw it in Israel, Singapore, and United Kingdom. But basically, the areas that you see here were the possible incidents of the cases. What does it look like after 5 to 21 days? That's why in history taking, we ask when did you travel, where did you go in the past 3 weeks? If your patient presents with lymphadenopathies, headache, back pain, myalgia, fatigue. So the only difference with the other viruses that we talk about is the presence of the lymphadenopathy in the invasion period, which is usually 5 days time. Lesions range from a few or to several thousand and are often very painful. The rash will appear in stages 1 to 3 days after the onset of the fever, beginning on the face and progressing downwards, just like measles. But again, the lesions in measles are maculopapular. Okay? This one can be a range of macules, papules, vesicles, pustules, and or crust. Okay? The presence of the lymphadenopathy is a distinct feature of monkeypox and develops before the rash. And the monkeypox infection will last 3 to 4 weeks. Severe illness can occur in children. And you have to make sure, again, differential diagnosis, varicella or chickenpox, measles, smallpox, bacterial skin infections like scabies, syphilis. Check for medication allergies. Okay? Other febrile illnesses have to be considered, and it is a must to do a laboratory confirmation for the definitive diagnosis. So the rash affects the face, 95% of cases, the palms and soles, 75, mucosal membranes, and 70%. Actually, what I'd like you to do is to, while I'm talking about this, you have to access the guideline on or the atlas on monkeypox lesions because you will see there distinctively all these lesions and the areas that affected. The images are mostly from the genital or pelvic area and the perineum, but you also have lesions in the oral mucosa. You'll see ulcers mostly. It may take 3 weeks for a crust to disappear. Sometimes debilitating for not sometimes it's debilitating for most patients because it's manifest. You have a skin manifestation of the disease and it stays for a long time. Okay, so you have an active cutaneous or active mucosal lesions, and then you have the crusted and scab lesions. You have resolved and healed lesions in that particular atlas, and you have other clinical findings like conjunctivitis. Important for you to see it so that there will be recognition and the description in physical examination is so crucial. So the features, again, differentials across the viruses compared to chickenpox and measles, you don't have the lymphadenopathy. The rash will appear almost the same time for all these three, but the development of the rash is quite slow, whereas this for chickenpox and measles, this is acute. And then you have the distribution basically on the head and will spread out. But again, some classic features, it's an itchy rash for chickenpox, copic spots. I hope you know the description for chickenpox. It's a vesicular lesion with a erythematous base. They come in uh, this is individually, but if it's herpes zoster virus infection, you have it in crops in a particular dermatomal lesion. Death up to 11%, as shown in the table earlier. And in smallpox, you don't have lymphadenopathies, but smallpox is more contagious and often more fatal. So the laboratory diagnosis, the specimen is to get a sample of the fluid, the roof, or the crust. Again, this is very painful, so you should also be careful. And you have to do this under personal protective equipment because you can acquire it quickly with contact exposure. PCR based testing is the way to go, done at RITM. Okay? So do it with trained staff. Sometimes, most of the time, we call derma service, and again, make sure please personal protective equipment and observe transport safety of specimen. What is the prevention and treatment? I showed it to you in the table earlier. It's either you vaccinate, avoid sexual contact during that particular time, and of course, they can still shed beyond that. And that's it for monkeypox. Any questions? Be able to imagine the appearance of the patient now. Hey, no questions. Let's go to polio. You have a Picornaviridae family, picornavirus, enterovirus, which is called polio. Hosts are humans. This is orofecal transmission, contaminated water, food, lack of access to vaccines, and vaccine hesitancy because polio is a vaccine preventable disease. You have three serotypes with minimal heterotypic immunity, meaning immunity to one does not produce significant immunity to the other serotypes. Okay. Wait a minute. Sorry, I have to stop myself. I think I forgot to mention vaccination in dengue. Dengue is not vaccine not available so far, but there are already three vaccines for dengue. Okay? And they looked into the efficacy of that vaccine for the different serotypes and usually for dengue 3. So we go back to polio. It enters through the mouth, multiplies in the oropharynx and the GIT. After ingestion, the virus is thought to infect the epithelial cells in the gut mucosa, will spread and replicate in the submucosal lymphoid tissues of the Peyer's patches and even the tonsils. Will next spread to the regional lymph nodes, and then you will have a viremic phase again with a fever, and then the virus replicates in organs of the reticuloendothelial system, and the viremia will precede the onset of neurologic disease. The virus is said to enter the CNS through the bloodstream. So it's present in the nasopharyngeal secretions from 1 to 2 weeks, 12 weeks from the gastrointestinal tract, based on this particular reference in Harrison's. It's shed in stools for several weeks after infection, and even in individuals with minor symptoms or no illness. 3 to 5 days time after acquiring the virus, you will have an abortive poliomyelitis with, look at these symptoms again, very non-specific, but will resolve in 3 days. However, some patients will proceed with a non-paralytic poliomyelitis where they present with symptoms of meningitis, headache, fever, um, sometimes nuchal rigidity. Okay? And when you do a TAP, you have lymphocytic pleocytosis, a normal glucose or a normal slightly elevated protein, but the PMNs when the TAP is done early, your polymorphonuclear leukocytes or PMNs are the first ones to increase. And then you have, of course, your paralytic poliomyelitis. What happens? The patient will have urinary retention, you have weakness, fasciculations, decreased muscle tone, reduced or absent reflexes in the physical exam. If you have a bulbar paralysis involvement, your patient will complain of dysphagia, drooling, or dysphonia. There can be circulatory collapse, usually presenting as respiratory insufficiency due to aspiration, again because of the paralysis, and involvement of the respiratory center, particularly the medulla, or paralysis of the phrenic or intercostal nerves here near the diaphragm, and then you have severe medullary involvement leading to circulatory collapse. Uh, if you do a tonsillectomy, they say it will predispose to bulbar poliomyelitis. Tonsillectomy during the procedure, during the occurrence of the disease, or if your patient is still shedding the virus and you do the tonsillectomy. Intramuscular injections will increase the risk of paralysis in the involved limb. Okay. The paralytic polio is more common in the older adults, the pregnant patients, and persons exercising strenuously or undergoing trauma at the time of CNS symptoms. The diagnosis, you have 2 or more stool and throat samples for cultures done at least 1 day apart. And you can do acute and convalescent serum specimen determination. If you're going to do a lumbar puncture and the CSF culture is sterile, you have to perform the stool culture within 2 weeks after symptom onset because, again, they still might be shedding. You have an inactivated polio vaccine available in the Philippines. It's 3 doses in the unvaccinated. If you are an adult with who has received the primary series, you have to receive a single booster dose anytime present. If you're traveling to or staying in a polio endemic country, or a booster dose uh, received more than a year earlier, you have to receive another booster dose prior to departing. Does that apply in the Philippines? No, not really, as long as you receive the single booster dose. So this particular slide is saying if you're going to travel in other countries, okay, that have polio. Hand hygiene is particularly important, and make sure you drink water from clean sources. Questions for polio? Anyone encountered someone with polio? Wala, wala talaga. Are you guys asleep? Are you still with me? I like my topic.
Yes po, Doc.
I hope you feel how I like my topic. Let's now go to SARS-CoV-2, or what you know as COVID-19. This particular reference I'm showing here is because, again, under universal healthcare, you guys have to know that we have standards for diagnosis and testing, and there's uh, reimbursement that happens for the patient and for you. Depends if you follow the guidelines for the diagnosis for all these particular symptoms. Okay. So anything under the compendium of the DOH that I mentioned earlier is under the umbrella of all this field health reimbursement concerns. Okay. Okay. Next. So the syndrome is that you have upper respiratory symptoms, fever, cough, coryza, non-specific anorexia, nausea, vomiting. Patients can complain of loss of smell, loss of taste, fatigue, headache, and myalgia. I have a colleague who, back in 2022, complained of just simple as I cannot smell my perfume. She told me I cannot smell my perfume, and then she did a swab, and then that's it. She's COVID positive. For me personally, because of my line of work, I'm season 6 of COVID, and for each particular episode of my COVID, I have a different manifestation. So for the first one, only fever. For the second one, I think I had really dry cough. The third one is more of simple colds. The fourth one is asymptomatic. The fifth one I can't remember, but the sixth one is really off. Was off for me because after a clinical work in the outpatient, I went home and started sneezing nonstop, nonstop sneezing. And then I thought I just had allergies. Took an anti-allergy medication. Went went to work with my usual mask the next day, but I started having cold intolerance and chills, and everything was painful. So I said, "Oh, I'm going to have to test myself for COVID," and that's it. That's season 6 for me. But if you have moderate severity, you'll have all these symptoms. But in addition to possible risk factors, older adults, 60 years old and above, with comorbid conditions such as hypertension, all the cardiovascular risk, obesity, diabetes, malignancies or cancers, anyone having chemotherapy at that time, any transplant patient, HIV patient, pregnant patient, okay? Several risk factors which can be progression, but you don't have pneumonia on x-ray. If you have the moderate symptoms with pneumonia, however, you don't have the dyspnea or shortness of breath, RR less than 30, O2 saturation more than 95, 94 at room air, that's moderate with pneumonia. Severe is when you have signs of respiratory distress. Again, physical examination findings are so crucial. You have to look at your patient and say, oh, he looks acutely ill. He appears to be unable to eat, really weak looking, and then say that it's either you call it as moderate with pneumonia or severe. But when your patient is critical, you have all these findings plus the pneumonia on a radiographic image. Okay? And sometimes the patients will have deteriorating sensorium or multi-organ failure, which is a really bad thing by the time you recognize that, and thrombosis. So the diagnosis is based on a reverse transcriptase PCR, rapid antigen tests of nasopharyngeal swabs remain the diagnostic of choice to confirm You have alternative specimen, moderate evidence for oropharyngeal, saliva, drool or spit, and nasal swab. Based on this one and the COVID-19 living CPG of the Philippines and the throat swab, very low certainty of evidence. If the antigen test is negative, it should be confirmed with a PCR if it's highly suspected that the patient has COVID-19 infection and they have close contacts to a person who has probable or confirmed COVID-19. Laboratory tests like your CBC, if you want to know how severe it is, you have the liver function test, all the inflammatory markers, a blood gas, again, based on the severity classification that I showed you earlier. This slide will show the time course or the course of the disease and the clinical symptoms and signs and also the treatment, okay, that is recommended. So if your patient is in the mild or the moderate with risk for progression, they're eating, uh, you have to make sure that the antiviral is given. You don't see it here, but we have the Paxlovid antiviral. You have also the Molnupiravir antiviral, which we give in patients with mild or moderate without pneumonia, but with risk for progression. And the timing is crucial because they saw in some studies that you have to give it within 5 days of symptom onset for the antivirals to be effective. For remdesivir, you have to give it within a week of symptom onset if you're considering that the patient is in the moderate with pneumonia or going into severe. So you see that there's a pulmonary phase, there's a viral response phase, and a host inflammatory response. Usually by this time, it's around day 8 to 14 where we see all this inflammatory response. Acute respiratory distress syndrome patient is really dyspneic. So you have to make sure that you curtail or stop it as early as possible with either the antiviral given at the really appropriate time and the anti-inflammatory of dexamethasone and of course oxygen therapy. How do we prevent? Not only with vaccination, but also wearing of mask. It's highly encouraged in healthcare facilities, medical transport vehicles, hygiene and disinfection, especially if you're going around the hospital or at your homes. Make sure you do hand hygiene with alcohol-based hand rub or soap and water if your hands are soiled. And cough or cold etiquette is the way to go. Make sure you dispose your tissues as soon as possible. Don't keep them in your pockets. The virus can stay long in surfaces and refrain from touching your eyes, nose, or mouth, or those mucosal areas with unwashed hands, and after touching potentially soiled surfaces or objects. And for a ventilation, if you open your window, for example, you're at home, someone has COVID in your home, make sure you open the windows and it will allow 6 to 6 air exchanges actually and allow the circulation of air. It's not enough that you have an air conditioning. It's more important to have the actual air exchange or ventilation. The latest vaccines for the latest types of the virus are not available, but if you want to get them or you know someone or your loved one needs them, you have to ask them to go to other countries. This is the updated masking, quarantine, and isolation protocols. You're talking about symptomatic close contact exposed to someone who had COVID. You have a symptomatic but confirmed COVID. You have a confirmed positive patient with mild symptoms or moderate symptoms, and those with severe symptoms or who are immunocompromised. The recommendations are based on those. What's important to remember is not only the day, but they have to have a period where they have no fever, okay? At least 24 hours before they can go back to work or something like that. But if they have no symptoms, you can just ask them to wear a mask for that particular duration since testing. Okay, you see there 10 days. We now go to Zika. It's first identified again in Africa, rhesus monkeys, and then it's a flavivirus. Aedes mosquito, reservoir unknown. Here is that particular triangle of transmission, and breeding ground the same as for chikungunya and dengue. Okay. Traveler categories will also be at greatest risk for exposure: the adventure tourists, the long-term travelers or expatriates, travelers visiting friends and relatives, a pregnant female, or someone planning pregnancy, because infection during pregnancy can cause fatal brain defects. You actually have active areas of transmission, again, tropical countries, but being seen also in US at this time, some cases also in European countries. So you see it's the tropical belt. Okay. You have a confirmed Zika virus infection in Brazil, currently outbreaks in many countries. And you have intrauterine, perinatal, sexual, laboratory, and possible transfusion associated transmissions reported. And it's also detected in breast milk, but the risk for transmission through breast milk is unknown. So the benefit of breast milk for the baby outweighs that particular risk. What is the syndrome? They describe it so clearly in this particular picture. Not clear, but likely a few days, two or more of the following during or within 2 weeks of travel: fever, a rash, arthralgia, and conjunctivitis. So if you're going to put chikungunya, dengue, and Zika side by side, one intermediate host, uh, all three will have fever, two of them will have rash, two of them will have arthralgia, one of them will have conjunctivitis as the most common manifestation. You can have conjunctivitis with the others, but that's really, really rare. Symptoms will last for 2 to 7 days. Okay? But for most infection causes, for most infection will have no symptoms, and there's no lasting harm. Other symptoms can be edema, headache, lymphadenopathy, retroorbital pain, and vomiting. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a rare complication. Sometimes patients will report encephalopathy, meningoencephalitis, myelitis, uveitis, and severe thrombocytopenia with Zika virus infection. So recognition again is important, and you're faced with a patient who is pregnant and has a history of travel or is going to history of travel from an area with Zika virus outbreaks. Get the history, test for the Zika. If it's positive or inclusive or inconclusive for Zika virus, consider doing a fetal ultrasound and amniocentesis for Zika virus testing, which is a PCR test. Okay. You do the immunoglobulin or the neutralizing antibodies on specimen beyond the period of fever. If it's negative for Zika virus, fetal ultrasound to detect microcephaly or intracranial calcifications in the fetus. It might not detect the microcephaly until the late second or early third trimester of pregnancy. And amniocentesis is not recommended until after 15 weeks of gestation and tested again with PCR. Down the line, you will have to, if there's detection of changes in the fetus CNS, you will have to retest the patient and consider amniocentesis again if it's beyond 15 weeks. If the microcephaly is not present, you have to do routine prenatal care. Can you have joint pain in dengue? Yes. You can have joint pains. Always non-specific. But the pain is particularly different or more severe with chikungunya. So mothers are encouraged to breastfeed their infants even after a possible Zika virus exposure because again of the benefits of breastfeeding, all those antibodies are important for them to get. Okay. Offered to pregnant women without clinical illness consistent with Zika, but should include an IgM. If the test result is positive or indeterminate, do neutralizing antibodies and perform 2 to 12 weeks after travel for the IgM. Okay. Any questions so far? So you have similar manifestations. You have to, for a differential diagnosis, we assume that you know how adenovirus infection presents: chikungunya, enterovirus infections, hand, foot, mouth disease, leptospirosis, malaria, measles, rubella, group A strep infection. Dami, di ba? Dami. Okay. But you have to remember also, for this particular IgM test, just like the dengue IgM, you will have false positive results. That's why you need the PCR. There should be laboratory evidence of maternal Zika virus infection. Any specimen can be taken, or if you have an IgM that confirms neutralizing antibodies more than fourfold the baseline, okay, it's inconclusive is if Zika are less than fourfold than the dengue virus antibody titers. Okay. If with current or previous lab confirmed Zika virus infections, but no evidence that prior infection poses a risk for birth defects, but viremia is expected to last around 1 week in patients with a clinical illness. There's no current evidence for the risk of fetal infection if the fetus is conceived after maternal viremia has resolved. But this is how it looks like. Almost around 50% will have this complication, small head. Okay. 85%, the infant's brain may not have developed properly or may have stopped growing in the first year of life and may experience developmental delays or intellectual defects or even hearing loss. There is no treatment for an unusually small head, just therapies to deal with consequences. Why is this important? Uh, this, the virus has a tropism, or it really attaches or makes itself into several places in the body. Okay? You have the eyes, you have body fluids, genital areas, and even the placenta. The time frame, this is from the date a person departs a location or from the start of symptoms or date of diagnosis. Okay? Should be at least 3 months and at least 2 months since all this before you advise your patients to uh, have sex. Okay? No questions so far? Do I have a question? Only way to differentiate PCR. Yes, but sometimes that's a logistical issue because again, it's costly and you have to do it clinically. So if you do the NS1 antigen that has high sensitivity and specificity at that particular time, you clinch that diagnosis if your patient presents with that particular syndrome. Otherwise, it will be for chikungunya, it's more of the joint pains more than instead of the rash. For Zika, it's the rash more than the joint pains. You get what I mean? Something will stick out in their particular history. Any other question? I hope I answered your question. Okay. For me, remember, I think I gave you the lecture on history in second year, and history is so important. History, history, history. History 60% gives you the diagnosis combined with physical exam. The laboratories are just to support your assessment. So prevention, avoid mosquito bites, use condoms or abstain from sex if exposed or possibly exposed. Again, this will be the timeline. Okay. And to summarize this particular topic, you have their agent or pathogen causing the disease, the host, the occurrence of the disease, and the interventions that we talked about, okay, in the particular arm. If in relation to agent and environment, it will be this. In relation to host and agent, it will be this. And in relation to host and environment, it will be all this. And remember that you have to consider a lot of characteristics for these three factors. That's the end of the first topic. It's 9:05. Can you give me 5 minutes break? Is that okay?
Yes po, Doc.
5 minutes. Thank you. I'm back. I drank water. Hey, are you ready? You guys ready?
Yes po, Doc.
Sige. Okay. Game na. Hi. This is so specific that I'm now saying you have this particular chapter on tuberculosis in Harrison. This is only 4 pages. Okay? Those 4 pages I summarized into a table, and it will not include all the therapeutics anymore because I already asked if the lecture on pulmonary TB will include all those. So this is extrapulmonary TB, and this is the table. I think I have 5 slides for this. I divided it into the system involved, epidemiology meaning how frequent does it occur, what or who is involved, the pathogenesis that happens, the clinical syndrome, and the procedures or imaging for the diagnosis. Okay. Now, if we go by lymph nodes, you have the painless swelling of your posterior cervical or supraclavicular sites, which is known as scrofula. They start out as discrete, separate, movable, non-tender, sometimes tender, but they become matted eventually. The patients delay the consult. There are several differential diagnoses that you'll have to read about in the chapter. I'm mentioning nocardia based on risk factor, acute HIV. Mm, you have rare diseases like chikungunya, which or Kikuchi's disease, which is a non-infectious or a rheumatologic condition. You also have to think about malignancy if you have nodes. Okay. Fine needle aspirate biopsy or surgical excision biopsy for the sample and perform a culture which is positive in 70 to 80% of cases. When we talk about pleural effusion in relation to respiratory symptoms, based on the history, you might have to consider pulmonary tuberculosis or extrapulmonary tuberculosis of the pleura or even empyema. So separating this particular pathogenesis for TB empyema, you have a continuous parenchymal spread or a possible rupture of a cavity, lesion, and spillage into the space, or as hypersensitivity response to the presence of the antigens. Patient presents with fever, pleuritic pain. When they breathe, it's painful. There's a cut, what is this? Sudden stopping of breathing because it really causes them pain. And there's a dull percussion, absence of breath sounds. 1/3 with parenchymal lesion if your patient has an effusion. Again, emphasizing that the physical exam and the history are important. Perform a thoracentesis if the volume allows it, and pleural fluid will appear straw colored, sometimes hemorrhagic. The findings are exudative by Light's criteria, more than 50% of protein, and compared to 4 to 6 grams in the serum, normal to low glucose, low pH, several cells, and lymphocyte predominance. But you can also clinch diagnosis with pleural biopsy, send that for TB-PCR or GeneXpert and culture. Upper airway, this is contagious. Okay? It's a complication of advanced cavitary PTB, involves the larynx, the pharynx, and epiglottis. Your patient presents with hoarseness, dyspnea, dysphonia, no, not dyspnea, dysphagia, and they have a productive cough, a cough that won't go away. And a differential diagnosis would be larynx malignancy, but this one is painless. And then procedure or imaging to do is an ulceration, a biopsy. I know you see ulcerations through laryngoscopy. Direct sputum smear microscopy is often positive. That means you do an AFB smear alone. It's positive because nga, it's really contagious. It's there. It's staying here. And then each time they talk, it's there. It's airborne. And then perform a biopsy of the lesion if you find it. Because again, you have to rule out this condition because there is a difference, a large difference in treatment. For the genitourinary tract, you have 10 to 15% of cases, females affected more than males. If it occurs in males, it affects the epididymis. Sometimes the course is indolent. It's more of findings in the urinalysis. Just recently, I had a perfect example of a patient who's been seeing a nephrologist, and they kept doing. The patient has increasing creatinine, and the nephrologist did all the workup, couldn't find anything. It's always a sterile pyuria, and as you see here, and although they weren't considering TB at that time, they actually did an imaging which showed all these changes that you see here: obstruction, urethral stricture, hydronephrosis, causing the increase in the creatinine. But the patient just said in the history she had weight loss, which she attributed to voluntary weight loss that started back in January. But her creatinine started increasing in December last year, and the workup was done only in August, for which they saw this particularly lobulated kidney and all again the changes. And they, when they opened, they did a nephrectomy. Nephrectomy, again, patient has no symptoms in relation to urination, no fever. They opened the kidney and there was all pus. Okay? And then histopathology, they did a gram staining culture and nothing grew there, but they didn't do a PCR because they were thinking, oh, maybe it's just because it was pus. They thought it was bacterial. But the histopath clinched the diagnosis of clinically diagnosed extrapulmonary TB with that particular description of chronic granulomatous disease. So the patient is now on anti-TB treatment, and exemplifying all these particular information. If your patient presents with genitourinary symptoms, you have pelvic pain, menstrual abnormalities, or even infertility, you will have to do a curettage and biopsy or culture. Now we go to skeletal TB. It's the spine more than the hip, more than the knee. Pott's disease involves the upper lumbar and lower thoracic. In adults, it will be different for the children. It's a reactivation of hematogenous foci or the spread from adjacent paravertebral lymph nodes. You have a gibbous formation, the change in the shape of the torso of the patient because of the collapse of the vertebral bodies. You have a cold abscess, a psoas abscess, or a soft tissue mass. Patient can have paraplegia, and paraparesis is a medical emergency. You have to perform a CT or MRI, do an aspiration or bone biopsy, and arthrocentesis if the patient's knee is involved. And again, that will be TB gene expert. And if your patient has a history of TB treatment or exposure, you have to include a TB culture as well. Now, the CNS, as presenting as meningitis or tuberculoma, is only 5% of EPTB. However, more than one half of cases have pulmonary lesions or miliary pattern on X-ray. It's a hematogenous spread of a primary or a post-primary tuberculosis. And there's a rupture of the tubercle into the subarachnoid space. Your patient presents with classic symptoms of meningitis. Again, sometimes just weight loss. There's headache, mental changes, low-grade fever, malaise, anorexia, irritability, sometimes lethargy. But when you see all this lethargy, altered sensorium, you're in the late part of the course. You have neck rigidity as a physical exam over 1 to 2 weeks. And sometimes when you have focal ischemia, your patient presents with a stroke-like symptom. It's a vasculitic type of event, and your patient will have paresis of the affected cranial nerve. Sometimes patients are asleep, cannot wake them up. They're in a coma because of hydrocephalus and increased cranial pressure. And this required steroid for treatment. So the steroid is 6 to 8 weeks during the intensive phase, and it's weight based. And there's a tapering that has to occur because it's a long period of time. Again, the reason why I'm giving you the references is because not only to ensure that the data is valid, but because I want you to read the textbook. You will learn a lot. Okay. And then you perform a lumbar puncture, high protein, low glucose, predominantly lymphocytic. However, in the early part, you can have neutrophilic predominance. The CSF-CS for TB is diagnostic in 80% of cases with an 80% sensitivity if you actually use the GeneXpert or the nucleic acid antigen test. And you can also perform a CT scan or MRI if you want to see all those changes. Some patients will have a sequelae or a complication from all this. Depends on how early or how late the recognition of the disease is. From a gastrointestinal tract standpoint, you have a swallowed sputum. So you have a sputum with TB, and then you keep swallowing that. Or it can be a hematogenous spread. Peritonitis, direct spread from ruptured lymph nodes and organs. Your patient presents with abdominal pain, swelling, obstruction, hematochezia, a palpable mass. Symptoms will be fever, weight loss, anorexia, night sweats. This is classic. And then the misconception that it has to be 2 weeks. That's not. It's not. Okay. That's why all these non-constitutional all these constitutional non-specific symptoms you have to consider a lot. Okay. And then your patients, if you do an endoscopy, you can find ulcerations, fistulas, a differential diagnosis of Crohn's disease, and peritonitis. Patients will have abdominal pain, and you can elicit ascites in the physical examination. Surgery for biopsy, but for peritonitis, it will have to be a paracentesis, findings of exudates, and high protein. You have a lymphocyte predominance with a WBC, and you might have to do a peritoneal biopsy. Again, you have to rule out other diseases. Okay. For the pericardium, it's a high case fatality rate, and then direct extension from adjacent mediastinal or hilar lymph nodes or a hematogenous spread. Patient presents with dyspnea, fever, dull retrosternal pain, pericardial friction rub is when you either place your hand or the stethoscope on the patient's chest and you hear a grating sound that you cannot understand. And you say, is this crackles? Is this coarse crackles? But it's just in relation to breathing and it just keeps scratching. Okay. You have a CT or MRI where effusion and thickness across the pericardial space. Definitively, you have to do pericardiocentesis where you have to puncture the area, get the fluid, especially if your patient presents with hypotension or tamponade. And then a culture of that particular fluid in 2/3 of cases will clinch the diagnosis, but do a biopsy. Lastly, you have miliary or disseminated tuberculosis. This is hematogenously spread. You have yellow granuloma resembling millet seeds if you do an open biopsy, or if you even have, are you able to expectorate sputum? Sometimes if one of the patients presented with joint swelling and then they did a biopsy of that particular lesion on the joint, and when they opened it was all seeds. Then they did an x-ray post and they saw all these miliary. Can you imagine? That was a infection control issue. Anyway, you have night sweats, anorexia, weakness, weight loss, cough, sometimes abdominal symptoms. Patients, because it's so spread out already into the body, your patients will have hepatosplenomegaly and lymphadenopathy. And when your patient starts to manifest this, you'll have to think again, is the patient at risk for fungal infection? Does the patient have a concomitant HIV presenting like this? Or hepatosplenomegaly can also be seen in non-infectious causes like leukemia or Hodgkin's lymphoma. So make sure you get that good physical exam as well. For the eye exam, choroid tubercles is pathognomonic of miliary TB. It's important that you see miliary TB. Actually, in the X-ray, you can actually refer to an ophthalmologist and state that, oh, I want to check for choroid tubercles. Then you have that. Patient presents again with pancytopenia because of the involvement of the spleen and the dissemination of disease affecting the T lymphocyte system. Reticulonodular densities, biliary in appearance. The AFB smear can be negative in most cases, but perform still the TB gene expert and the culture. Do a transbronchial biopsy or a bronchoalveolar lavage. And if you're going to do a BMA, look for granulomas. Hey, that's it for me. Do you have any questions? Does Such a good question. Does the patient need to be diagnosed with pulmonary TB before being diagnosed with EPTB? No, not really. Sometimes the extrapulmonary manifestation starts first. The only reason why you have to do an X-ray after establishing the extrapulmonary TB diagnosis is because under the National TB program, when you enroll your patients into the DOTS clinic or the Directly Observed Treatment Short Course clinic, it's a requirement to have an X-ray done. Will it change the duration of treatment? Not really, unless you have the skeletal involvement or the CNS involvement, which is actually a year's time or more as treatment. Well, all the others are 6 to 9 months. Hope that answers that. Any other question? I'll stop sharing now so I can see everybody. Okay. Uh, I hope you enjoyed. I really like my topic. Doc, who do we inform when encountering emerging diseases? Okay. Good question. All the emerging infectious diseases, there's an actual surveillance system of DOH. So if you're already in clinical practice, you're in your own clinic, you see these cases, you will have to send them to a facility because the facility is required to report that particular condition. Okay? Because if you're not going to do that, you have to call the LGU of your area because it's reportable. So usually we see these patients in the emergency room, and the case definitions are followed. We have a checklist and everything like that. And then it goes into the system. It's reported by either the hospital epidemiologist or the infection control people. Okay, no more questions? Oh, I'm sad. If you have no more questions, I'll let you guys go.